The Watcher in the Walls, a tale of unseen terror. Clara had moved to the old house in the countryside in search of peace and solitude, a fresh start, away from the noise and chaos of the city, seemed like the perfect way to heal after the difficult events that had driven her away. The house, an old mansion converted into apartments, was beautiful in its own way, but there was something unsettling about it. The air felt thick with history, and the creaky floors whispered secrets that seemed almost forgotten. Her apartment was on the top floor, in a room with large windows that overlooked the dark, sprawling forest. At night, the view was eerie. The trees, twisted and bare, reached out like skeletal fingers, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the landscape. The house itself seemed to groan and shift as the wind rattled its bones, the sounds of the old walls creaking and cracking adding to the oppressive atmosphere. It was as though the house was alive, watching, waiting. Clara had been living in the apartment for weeks, but the discomfort never quite faded. Though she hadn't heard voices or seen any figures, she felt an unshakable sense of being watched. The long, echoing hallways of the mansion seemed to stretch on forever, and sometimes, in the stillness of the night, she swore she could hear faint whispers just beyond the reach of her comprehension. But whenever she tried to listen closely, the sounds would fade away, leaving only the silence that pressed in on her from every direction. It wasn't until one particularly quiet night that the situation escalated. Clara was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her mind raced, her thoughts endlessly turning over the same unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. That night, the house felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was thick with anticipation. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet her mind, when suddenly a faint noise broke the stillness. It started softly, like a scratching sound. Slow, deliberate. At first it was so faint that she thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans that she had come to expect. But the noise grew louder, sharper. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She lay still, eyes wide open in the dark, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the walls. Her heart began to race. It almost sounded like claws dragging across the wood, methodical and persistent, just a house settling, Clara muttered to herself, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. She pulled the covers tighter around her body, trying to ignore the growing unease in her chest. But the sound continued, louder now. Clara could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she slowly sat up in bed. The scratching seemed to be getting closer, as though whatever was behind the wall was moving toward her. Her pulse quickened, but her curiosity got the better of her. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor, and made her way toward the source of the noise, the wall that separated her bedroom from the next room. She pressed her hand against the cool surface of the wall, holding her breath, waiting for the noise to stop. But when her fingers made contact, the scratching ceased abruptly. As if the source had heard her, Clara's hand trembled as she felt the wall, searching for any signs of what could be causing the sound. There was a slight bump, a strange movement, as though something was pressing against the other side of the wall. A chill ran down her spine. Without thinking, she grabbed a hammer from her toolkit. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a pipe? An animal stuck somewhere? But when she tapped the wall, the wood gave way far too easily. The panel in the wall shifted, revealing a narrow, hidden space beyond. The smell hit her first, a rancid, musty odor that immediately made her stomach turn. The air was thick and stale, and Clara's heart pounded in her chest as her eyes adjusted to the dim, claustrophobic space beyond the wall. There, in the far corner of the hidden room, a figure crouched, pale, with dark, empty eyes that stared straight at her. Unmoving, it was a child no older than 6 or 7, but there was something off about it. Its skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and its mouth hung slightly open, cracked and dry, though no sound came from it. The figure didn't blink, didn't make any movement, just sat there, watching Clara with an unnerving intensity. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She stood frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the child's gaze. There was something horribly wrong with the way he stared at her, as though it had been waiting for her, watching her every move since she arrived. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The child didn't respond. Slowly, cautiously, Clara took a step forward. Her foot scraped against the floorboards, and the child's eyes flickered, but its gaze never wavered. The air in the hidden space felt thicker, suffocating. A deep guttural noise rumbled from behind the child, and Clara's gaze shifted. There, just beyond the child, the wall seemed to shift, as if something was moving behind it, something large, far too large to be hidden behind a simple plaster wall. Suddenly, the child's head snapped to the side with an unnatural jerk, and a low, growling noise rumbled from its throat. It wasn't the sound of a child. It was something far deeper, more sinister. Then the child spoke, its voice a horrific screech, like nails on a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have come." Clara stumbled back, her body filled with panic. The child's form twisted and contorted, limbs stretching in impossible directions, deforming like a grotesque puppet, and from the far corner of the hidden space something else began to emerge. A shadow. A shape that should not exist. The shadow was massive, its long, ragged arms scraping against the floor like claws. It crawled slowly toward Clara, its form monstrous, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, scrambling for anything to defend herself. She grabbed the nearest object, a wooden chair, and hurled it toward the shadow. The chair collided with the wall, but the shadow didn't flinch. It just kept coming. Panic surged through her, making it hard to breathe, to think, to move. The shadow's eyes locked onto hers, and it felt as though it knew her, had known her for years. The walls around her closed in, suffocating her, as if the house itself were alive, actively closing in on her. The child's form continued to deform, its limbs stretching further, and a shriek erupted from its mouth. A sound that was no longer the voice of a child, but a chorus of voices, all trapped in one twisted body. It was the echo of pain, of torment, an endless scream. Clara screamed too, but it was drowned out by the deafening beat of her own heart. She stumbled backward, her foot hitting the cracked wall. The shadow lunged forward, its claws reaching for her just inches from her skin. Then, with a thunderous crash, the wall behind her split open and the shadow vanished into the dark void beyond it. Clara froze, unable to move. She stared into the empty space where the shadow had been, trying to process what had just happened. Fear still gripped her, every part of her body trembling. The terror, the cold dread, lingered deep within her bones. But then, as though the nightmare wasn't over, she heard the voice again. The child's voice, louder now, clearer. "You shouldn't have come." Clara spun around, but the room was empty, nothing but darkness. And then, just when she thought it had ended, the walls began to scratch again. This time, it was louder. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the scratching continued. It was coming from all around her now, the sound reverberating through the walls, echoing in the silence like a warning. The very air in the room felt thick, suffocating, pressing in on her as if the walls themselves were alive and closing in. She stumbled toward the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the handle. The sound grew louder, more frantic, and Clara's breath became shallow, rapid. Every instinct in her screamed to escape, to run, to get out of this place. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, as if the house itself were holding her in place. With a final desperate yank, the door creaked open, and she fled into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty, dimly lit space. The house felt even darker now, more oppressive, as if it had shifted somehow, like a living thing that was aware of her every movement. She turned, half expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the shadows behind her, but there was nothing. Only the eerie stillness of the mansion. The scratching didn't stop. Clara's mind raced as she ran down the long hallways, her footsteps echoing against the old wood. The house felt endless now, its vastness stretching out like a maze. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling through the windows, made her feel as though she was being hunted. There was nowhere safe, nowhere to hide. It was as though the house itself had become a trap and she was its prey. She reached the staircase, her heart pounding louder with every step. The sound of the scratching was still there, closer now, as if something was following her. Clara could almost feel the presence behind her, could almost hear the whispers growing louder and louder, until they became indistinguishable from the noise that filled the walls. It was a chorus of voices, like a cacophony of whispers, all calling out to her. "You shouldn't have come," they said, in 1,000 different voices, all at once. Her legs trembled as she descended the staircase, her hands gripping the banister for support. At the bottom of the stairs, the door to the outside loomed, a sliver of freedom she had to reach, just a few more steps. But as she reached the door, something stopped her. A noise. A whisper that seemed to come from the very walls, filled the space around her. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized the house had never been silent. It had always been watching, always been waiting, and now it was speaking to her, urging her to understand the truth. "You shouldn't have come." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She didn't need to look to know that she wasn't alone anymore. The walls around her began to shift again, and in the darkness, shadows moved. She felt them before she saw them. Long, dark shapes, like claws reaching from the walls themselves, stretching toward her with an unnatural slowness. The door was right there, but her body wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding her in place, paralyzing her with fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but no sound would come out. It was as though the house had taken her voice, as if it had swallowed her whole. In the corner of her vision, a figure began to emerge from the dark. At first it was just a shape, but as it drew closer, Clara saw it clearly. A figure that should not exist. It was the child again. Its form now even more grotesque than before, its body twisted and unnatural, its eyes wide and unblinking. "You shouldn't have come." The child's voice rasped, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. The words were not a warning anymore, they were a curse, a promise. The figure lurched forward, its limbs stretching and contorting in ways that made Clara's stomach churn. It reached for her, its fingers elongated and clawed, and Clara could feel the chill of its touch even before it made contact. The walls seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her, until there was nowhere left to go. Then, as the child reached out to her, there was a sudden crash, and the shadowy figure behind it shifted, moving with a mindless, relentless hunger. It was a darkness that had been waiting, watching, a presence far older than the house itself, and as it surged forward, Clara felt the weight of its gaze, a presence that seemed to pierce her very soul. For a moment, everything went black. When Clara finally came to, she was no longer in the mansion. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious or where she was, but the world around her felt different, almost dreamlike. She found herself standing at the edge of the forest she had once seen through her bedroom window. The trees looming like sentinels in the fading light of dusk. The wind whispered through the branches, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. There was no sound of the house, no scratching from the walls, no child's voice. It was as if everything had ceased to exist. But when Clara turned to look behind her, she saw it, the mansion, standing tall in the distance. It was no longer the place of peace she had hoped for. It was a prison, a dark, ancient thing that had swallowed her whole and was waiting to consume her again. The shadows moved, stretching across the lawn like living tendrils, reaching for her. And then, in the silence of the forest, she heard it once more. "You shouldn't have come." The house was never done with her.